everyone, welcome back to the Hobby Maker tutorial YouTube channel. Today we're going to be looking at some techniques with gouache. My name's Sharon Curtis. I've been doing Himi shows for about 6 or 7 months now, so today's video is going to be all about some basic techniques with gouache. So let's talk about the cardstock first of all. I like to use 2 different pads when I'm using gouache. Himi have this lovely gouache pad which is white, and I do use this for a lot of my practicing and playing around. But I do like with gouache, because it can be opaque when you start layering it, my favourite actually is this craft book. Because I do like the look of the colour against the craft. So with gouache you can do different things, and you can play around with different paper pads that you come across. You don't need to be using the most expensive watercolour paints, I feel, with gouache. If you're using them as watercolours and you're just colouring in your stamped images, go for watercolour cardstock. But if, like me, you want to practice some of your sort of painting techniques, just pick your favourite really, and as I say, my favourite is this craft colour. So let's talk about, I'll get to a blank page and we'll talk about how gouache works. So the first thing is to talk about is opacity, because I've mentioned that you can use them like watercolours if you go in with a thin layer, but layering them up, because they're opaque, you don't have to think about your layers in the same way you do with watercolours. So let's just put some colour, let's grab a bit of colour and put it on here, and I'll talk about the different consistencies that you're going to be working with. So if you're starting out colouring in, or if you're watercolouring, if I were colouring in a stamped image, this is the kind of consistency I'd be using. So there's a lot of water there, there's only a tiny speck of the gouache, and it's very watered down. Now on the craft card you can see it doesn't show up quite so sort of vividly because there's a lot of water there, there's not much paint. Now, when you are using gouache, one thing to think about is light colours dry darker, dark colours dry lighter. So this is quite a light colour, this will dry a little bit darker than it initially looks. So it's quite easy to think about, lights go dark, darks go light, so that's an easy thing to remember. Now, in terms of painting, I would usually tend to start my first layer like that. Because quite often with gouache, I'm going to show you something I did on a show actually just this last week. I had sketched with pencil a pumpkin. Now there were pencil lines under this. When I came in with my first layer, it was as watery as that. So I could still see my pencil lines, and I've built that up. Now this arrow, because I was doing this on air and I was explaining, this is where my light's coming from. So can you see this side I've gone in with some darker colours, this one I've gone in with a very light yellow because that represents where the light hits. So you can really get some very realistic looks just by thinking about how you're colouring your layers are. So that would be my first layer, which would be quite watery. Then I would be coming in with a mix that's maybe the consistency of thick cream, like a double cream. And you'll see straight away the colour shows instantly a bit more vivid. And then I would be building that up. I'd be adding in more paint until you're at the point where you're pretty much using neat paint. Now with gouache you're never really going to be using the paint neat because it is so thick. If I show you, if I come in straight on here, it's so thick that it's kind of hard to move it around. You'll find that even if you're just damping your brush a little bit to make it move, you will be adding a little bit of water even to the thickest mix. So those are kind of the different levels of opacity that I would be using. Now we'll come back and look at that in a little bit when it's dried out. It won't take long, and you'll see more clearly then the differences between the amount of water I've used. So let's talk about layering and blending. So let's start. I'll pick a different colour just so it's easy to see. Let's go with a nice sort of aqua green. And I'll pop some on my palette. So my first layer, if I were painting something with this, would be very watery. Let's just do a square here. So this would be my first layer, and I'd be going in with plenty of water. If I'd drawn any pencil marks under here, I'd still be able to see them. So I'd be able to follow my guidelines if I'd drawn something to start with. So then I might want to come in and say my light was coming from here. I might want this side to be darker, this side to be lighter. Now with watercolours, you'd be kind of leaving this area completely as it was and going on all the other areas with the dark to make that appear lighter. But the beauty of gouache is because it can be opaque as you layer it, I don't have to worry about that. I can come in right in the end with a white and pop it there. So let's go along this side with a slightly darker shade. And we'll just go down this side to give the illusion of shade down this side. Now, until the layer underneath is dry, I can move that around quite a lot. So you do want to ideally let your layers dry in between. Obviously, as we're working, we don't really have that luxury. So let's come in with a completely different colour, a darker colour, to really highlight this. So to come in with shade, now that is still a bit wet. So as long as I dab, I can avoid moving that around, and I can add in some real shade down that side. And on the other hand, if I want this side to look lighter, I can even come in with a white and add my highlights in here straight away. And that will show. Now that's totally unlike watercolours, because if you put white over any watercolour, it's just going to blend in and you won't see it. The other thing to talk about with gouache is how you can reactivate it. Now those first ones I've done have dried, so you can see the nice colour shades. I can come in now with water, and that's totally dry. I can move that colour. If I'd been using acrylic paints, once they're dry you can't move them. So that's something that makes gouache kind of easier to use, because if you're not happy with something, you can always come back in and blend it. Now this isn't quite dry, but let's pretend it is. Where I've put that shadow in there, it's a very sort of stark line as such. Now I might want to blend that out a little bit. Now even when that's totally dry, you can come in with a damp brush and you can go along the edge and just soften that out and blend it. And look how that just merges in and gives you've still got the look of shade on that side, but it's not like a line. Same with the white. If I felt that looked a bit stark, I can blend it out and soften it up a little bit. So that's going to give you a darkened shade. So in lots of ways, I find gouache, although we're all intimidated by it because we think it's a bit arty, I'd say it's actually easier to use than watercolours for things like that. So that's kind of the basic layering and blending. In terms of painting with it, there's no right or wrong in terms of layers. I'm going to show you, take you back to, this actually was the very first thing I painted with gouache. This was my very first attempt. And you can see I've probably got 5 or 6 layers there. I've started with a very light yellow and I've gone in and I've just worked my way up with a medium yellow. Then I've come in right at the end with my highlights, and that does really make it easier to work with. So there's no right or wrong in terms of layers, just keep going. And I will say, when you're halfway through and you're kind of in your mid yellows, it looks terrible. You will think, oh, I'm not sure about this, I think I've messed it up. But actually it kind of looks worse before it gets better. Keep going. And the beauty is, because they're opaque, if you really aren't happy with it, say if I really wasn't happy with this lemon, I could cover the whole lemon now with a lighter yellow and start again, building up. So they're very forgiving in that way, because at any point you can literally paint over and start again. So let's take these techniques we've just looked at and the different consistencies and actually apply it to something. So let's paint a leaf. So the first thing I'm going to do is choose a green, and I'm going to go with a nice kind of, let's start off with a nice lime green. So a nice bright vivid green. So for my first layer, as I sort of explained, I like to start with a really watered down wash. Now for leaves, I tend to use a round brush, and I use this same technique for both watercolours and gouache actually. I like to use a round pointed brush, and I start with the tip, then I push down, bring it up and lift, and that gives you your basic leaf shape. Now from here you can move the colour around to make sure you've got a sort of even coverage, and if you want to make it fuller you can play around with it, but that gives you a good sort of starting point. So let's make that a little bit bigger. So that's my basic shape. Now that won't take long to dry, so my next step is to think about layering it up. So the next thing is to bring in a slightly darker colour. I could go in with the same colour but just thicker, but of course with the particularly with the Himi paints, I've got so many colours to choose from, I can come in with a different shade. Let's go with a more sort of pistachio type colour, and I'm going to come in just along one side, and this is where I said about it looking worse before it looks better, because at this point it will kind of look a bit messy. And I'm just going to layer that on. I'm being careful not to kind of scrub at this, because at any point, even after this is totally dry, you can reactivate the paint underneath. So with gouache, it's a good idea to wait for the layers to dry. Obviously, if you're doing a whole painting, that's easy to do, because you'd move away from this leaf and go and do a flower and come back. You organically would work your way around the painting, so you're not concentrating on one thing at a time. But obviously we're just showing an example here. So you can see that's starting to dry, so I can now come in with, I'm going to come in with a really dark colour. I'm going to start to think about my light and shade. So I'm going to come in with a really dark green. And I think the bottom half of this would be darker. And you can be as bold as to literally colour half of this with the darker colour. Because with gouache I find that whole sort of abstract look really works. So don't worry about blending out or shading at this point. Just go for it. Just think the bottom half, that's going to be darker. I'm going dark. And then we can think about the top half, which will be lighter. So I'm going to come in with an even lighter shade and dab that on. I'm dabbing just because I know that first layer is nowhere near dry yet. I would normally just be painting this on, but I'm kind of being careful not to move that around. So that looks very like a stripe down the centre, which is fine at this point. Don't get caught up with it looking like a child's done it at this point, because that's kind of how it is. So you're going to let that dry a little bit, and then we're going to think about blending that out, adding other colours. So let's get some colours ready as that dries. I'm just going to clean off my palette a little bit, and we'll think about some other colours that we're going to be using, just to give that a couple of seconds to dry. So for highlights, you can be as bold as just coming in with white. So we'll pop a bit of white on here ready. Now with most of the Himi sets they give you a couple of whites, so we'll pop some white on there. And then even on the darker shade I'm going to want some sort of dappled effect of colours, so I'm going to grab more of a sort of mid-green. I feel maybe a sort of teal type green, just to add a bit of interest. Now the top half I've gone with the lime, and I'm going to do highlights with white, but we could even bring in a bit of yellow at this point. So let's grab some nice yellow, and between the yellow and the white I think I will use those to give the look of veins. Now I've been using a fairly large round brush up until this point. When you get to the detail points you might want to switch to a slightly smaller brush. So I'm going to switch to a smaller brush because we're now talking about the details. Now that isn't quite dry as you can see, but we'll go with it. You will get a better result than I am if you leave it to dry. So I'm going to start with the dark area because I painted that first. I feel that's going to be slightly drier than the top. And I'm just going to add a bit of colour here and there. I'm not being particularly specific. I'm just dabbing on a bit of that colour. And you can go in with it pretty much neat. That's just going to give an overall effect of some variety on your leaf. Now I'm going to look at the top half and I'm going to come in with a bit of yellow and do the same thing. Just going to add some colour here and there. Just a bit of variation so it's not all flat. Now this is the point where I want to lose that stripe down the centre because that does look a bit unrealistic. And if you think about the shape of the leaf, the shadow wouldn't be in a straight line, it would be a little bit more curved. So this is where I can start to just blend that line and make it a little bit more of a curved line and blend it out. And then we want some highlights. Now if you feel like you're losing your crisp edges, you can always come in with a darker shade. Let's come in with the dark green. I feel this is going a bit fuzzy here, so we can sort of crisp that up a little bit. There we go. And blend that out. If you just dot it, it will blend into the colour next to it a little bit. There we go. And the same for the top. If you feel like your edges are getting a bit lost, you can touch that up. And the last thing that you're going to want to add is white. Now ideally you absolutely want to wait till that's dry, but we're going to go with it. And I'm going to add just some little highlights here. And then I want to do some veins, and I think white might be a bit bright, so I'm going to mix the white with a tiny touch of that light green to give me a nice light shade, but it's not quite bright white. And then we can go in and add the sort of veins. Mine is blending a little bit because it's not quite dry. If you wait till the layer underneath is dry, you'll get a slightly more crisp finish than I'm getting. But you will get the idea, and then we can draw in the veins. But that's how you would do a leaf. And straight away when you look at that, you can see you've got light and shade and lots of variation. So that's how you would layer up the colours for any painting you want to do. Thanks for watching this video. I hope you've enjoyed all the techniques we've covered. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and also you might want to keep an eye out because we will be back soon with some more advanced techniques for both gouache and watercolours.